Hello, everyone. My name is Akal, and I am a somatic therapist. If you'd like to find out what that is, follow the link down below this video. Today, I'd like to talk about will. Reason why will is important, well, because it's been heavily usurped in our culture. Pretty much in every culture throughout history, in fact. Individual will is always taken secondary importance to collective will. So, with that said, I want to kind of talk about is there's sort of a feedback loop when it comes to will. So, the stronger your will is, in all likelihood, your core, the actual literal core of your body, is also most likely stronger. When I talk about will, I'm not talking about force. Um, so there's this idea that we have this power that comes from within, which is almost, I hesitate to use the term divine in nature, but it's spirit or energy or prana or whatever you want to call it. It's moving through us always, perpetually. And so there are certain aspects to our culture that have blocked the flow of this will. Force is that's like pushing yourself through something. To use force was kind of what I did for most of my life. In fact, going through school, working jobs, etc., etc., it was almost always an act of force. From the moment I woke up in the morning until I went to bed at night, it was push, 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 and it had very detrimental side effects upon my body in terms of like how I felt and my tension, etc. So the first thing that's really, really important to understand about your core or your center of gravity or your center of mass, whatever you want to call it, is that generally speaking, what's happened in our culture, because we have an intellectual emphasis, our center of gravity has shifted upward to our third eye point. And hence you see a lot of these head forward kind of postures, rounded backs, things like that, is because we're leading with our mind, with our head. And again, I think it's a beautiful thing that our thoughts and our general behaviors manifest in a physical form. So again, that idea that if you have a weak core, a physically weak core, you also have a weak will. If your will is weak, then your core is weak. And it goes vice versa, back and forth and through loop. So one of the things about when you relocate your center of gravity back down to your center of mass is that this pathway downwards, down the front of the body to your navel point, which is about 2 to 3 fingers below the actual navel, as your awareness moves back down into the physical form, you'll notice a number of things happen. One is you think less. You're spinning on things much, much less because there's a certain amount of confidence that rises when you feel integrated in your body. And that confidence allows for spontaneity in life, meaning you stop trying to control everything. And I'll get to the control piece a little bit later. So when in this progression back down to the body, it also speaks of the notion of balance. And this idea of balance, of that there, I guess, it's this idea that there's a right and a wrong. There's a higher self, a lower self. There's pure, there's impure, there's animal, and there's spiritual. There's all these sort of opposites. They may not be the right term, but duality, opposites, etc. When we get caught up in that game, we're spinning mentally. We're always like measuring this or that. And we're saying one thing is better than the other. And again, what we're showing here is preferences. If you are functioning through preferences, you are not in acceptance of yourself. Period. Life is full of pain, fear, and suffering, as well as joy, love, and all sorts of pleasure. It is both. You cannot have one without the other. You need the contrast. And that's not to say you're supposed to wallow in your shit, but you're supposed to accept when pain, fear, and suffering rises. When something manifests in your life that is uncomfortable, because you don't have a choice. And for you to resist it will create a block. It blocks flow. It blocks prana, spirit, chi, again, whatever you want to call it. So through our life's progression, from the moment we're born, our will is basically usurped. I think when we're children, we have a very vague notion of our individual will, which is fine. Our parents are there to help kind of mold us. So that's the first step in the conditioning process that we get. And again, I'm not speaking of these things in a negative way. They just are. And again, this is another aspect of our existence that we simply have to accept. So after our parents let us go, we go off into the world. Then what do we get? Well, then we go off to school. I still say the worst day of my life was the first day of kindergarten. And I mean that. I mean that quite literally. Like, it was the worst day of my life. Without doubt. That was the moment. And I remember crying really intensely when I went to kindergarten, partially because a deep part of me understood that my will is gone. I have no more individual choice. I no longer can choose how to structure my existence. And, not to say that, 4 or 5-year-old was really making many choices. But, I wanted to stay in the yard and play with the bugs and play with plants and be a little nature boy. Couldn't do that at school. So the school, we had this progression that lasts, I don't know, like 20 years. It's a very, very long time in that particular conditioned system. So we become very, very used to people telling us what to do. And to, hey, what's the next progression? What's the next step? Our classes are basically laid out for us. Again, where's choice? There isn't a whole lot. We choose whether to do our homework or not, basically. We choose to do good in school or bad in school. And for some of us, this really wasn't a choice. We just weren't good at school. I mean, I was very good at school only because force. I pushed very hard, and I was very uncomfortable. So after school, what happens? Well, then we go off to college, and then after college and grad school, et cetera, then we go off into a job market, probably saddled with a huge amount of student debt. Which again is our will is being usurped. I like to think how many of us take jobs in order to pay down student loans. And those student loans, anyway, they're really not necessary. And so the problem is like, what would you do if you didn't have to pay down your student loans? If you didn't have to work a job? And again, some percentage of us really like jobs. We like to work. We like the whole hustle of going from one job to the next and constantly sort of, building upon, our foundations and creating sort of new sort of horizons in our career. Other of us, no. Maybe the pathway is very, very different. Again, there's no better or worse or right or wrong. Some of us are cut out for this system and some are not. So then we get down to the sort of more philosophical usurpers. And I'll call that religion and philosophy. So religion and philosophy. Depending on how you perceive it, religion and philosophy will always, again, create separation. So good or bad, higher self, lower self, animal, spiritual, all these different things. Again, we are all of those things, always. We are good and bad. We have a higher self and a lower self, all at the same time. This isn't, it's not an act of preference. And the more you meditate, the more you realize that, you do have an animal self and you do have a spiritual self. But the problem with religion is, and a lot of philosophies, is they want you to choose one or the other. Now, what happens when you have religion and philosophy telling you to choose one thing or the other? You're not in your own inner authority. So the idea of inner authority is in contrast to the idea of outer authority. Outer authority is the Pope, the president, our government, which again, by the way, government means govern minds. And we trust those people. So the point is that we create this internal conflict. And this is, again, from birth on. And this internal conflict always blocks our will. It always blocks our will. So, and the idea here is that we're supposed to exercise all this control. So control and self-policing. I don't want to sin, so I have to police myself really, really intensely. which again just blocks flow. So what I'm suggesting is that it's really not about control or self-policing. It's about something I'm going to bring up in a moment, which is choice. So now I want to kind of quickly really talk about what happens when your will is really weak and you are subject to all these outer authorities. What happens is you become angry. You become a victim. This anger sometimes is not perceived by the ego or the personality. It just simmers and it agitates, and it basically will fester in our being. And then it comes out in all sorts of really interesting pissy ways, like road rage or snapping at our spouses or partners, etc., etc. So we owe it to ourselves to meditate, to cultivate awareness so that we are not creating chaos, and hurting those we actually love and care about because we feel disconnected from our will. So the will center is actually, in yoga talk, you can call it your third chakra. So the third chakra, again, is the sort of solar plexus, navel area, generically. There's a number of, physiological correlations to that part of the body, different nerve plexuses, etc. But what's important to really understand about this sort of third chakra is that, again, it really has to do with, our goals, our intentions, and our desires, and making sure that we're functioning in a clear way with those things. But again, if our will, our core, is weak, then clarity is difficult to come by. So in order to clear our will, there's a number of things you can do. And a lot of it has to do with, physical exercises. To physically, literally strengthen your core. So back extensions, back bends, all sorts of different interesting exercises, tabletops, different leg lifts, crunches, go on and on. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of different ways you can strengthen your core. Breath of fire and Kundalini yoga, which is, breath work done with the navel point, again, done with the belt line. All these different ways in which to kind of clear our will and to lower that center of gravity back down to our true center of gravity. And once it's in the clear center, or in your true center of gravity, rather, the beauty is that energy flows spontaneously. You don't have to fixate on it. And that's a wonderful thing. So in order for that to happen, though, we have to become very attuned to the signals that rise from our bodies. And the signals that rise from our bodies are our instincts and intuition. The gut instinct, very important. The gut instinct is so incredibly important. It says yes and no. And the beautiful thing about the gut instinct is the gut instinct literally transcends time and space. It is telling you, hey, let's say you go to a job interview. At the job interview, the guy offers you the 401k, the healthcare package, whatever. And this is all very attractive because you're unemployed. But if your gut goes, you got to listen. And the reason is because the energy is in the body. It's in the form. It's not here. You can rationalize yourself into something as much as you can rationalize yourself out of something, to making a choice or not making a choice. But the reality is that God is always telling you what to do with your energy, with your life force. And remember, it's closer to it than your ego. So it becomes, again, one of the things that we end up cultivating here is as we start to pay attention to our inner authority, our gut instinct, and we tune into these signals that the body gives off, we become more clear about our choices. So really everything bubbles down to choice. When you finally break away from the game of duality and this sort of like good and bad and this and that and everything else, what ends up happening is you start to realize with awareness, if you're meditating, if you're doing yoga, if you're doing qigong, tai chi, karate, whatever it is, and you're learning to lead with the navel point, with your gut, then what ends up happening is that choice actually becomes a choice. Like you can actually choose. And you realize that very much of your life can be chosen. You can choose what women to be with or men to be with, or you can choose what jobs to take, what not to take. And again, to have choice, it strengthens your will. And if your will is strengthened, you become much more sort of in tune with your core. So when you tune into your core, one of the ways in which you can tell if you are connected to your will is, do you feel a pulse? So below your navel, again, about 2 to 3 finger lengths below the navel, what you're going to feel is a pulse. And this pulse is, sometimes it'll feel like it's a little to the left or a little to the right or a little up or a little down. And these things, they mean something. Sometimes they mean like, oh, you have diarrhea or there's gas or, whatever it is. And so it'll shift the navel point one way or the other. So what's really important, though, is that you can actually feel it. And if you can't feel it, you have to start working on that part of the body. Again, it's about reconnecting the awareness, the ego, the personality to the physical form and sort of integrating. And it's through this process of integration that you find balance. And when you have balance, you have clarity. When you have clarity, you make choices. When you make choices, you get your will back. So let me think for a moment. Is there anything else I want to talk about? No. So, all that being said, again, what's really, really, really important to understand here is the first thing we have to understand is that if you feel like your will is weak, you have to recognize how you're being a victim. Victimization is, it's always because of constructs that we exist in. We can ride the victim wave forever. In fact, people make entire careers out of being victims. And so the one thing is that you need to recognize how you're being a victim. And is being a victim, does that empower you or not? Just ask yourself that. And then you got to ask yourself, what's below the victim? Is there anger? And what's that anger directed at? Again, reflect on these things. So with all that said, I appreciate your time and thank you much.